Imagine a world without a horizon. Imagine a place where the sky is not a ceiling but an infinite, terrifyingly deep ocean of black velvet. For all of human history, for hundreds of thousands of years, we have been cradle-bound. We have walked across continents, sailed across vast oceans, and flown through the thin blue ribbon of our atmosphere. But we had never left the gravity of our home. We had never severed the invisible tether that binds us to the Earth. Even the brave astronauts who had gone before, Gagarin, Glenn, Leonov, had only skimmed the surface. They were like children playing in the shallow water of the beach, still able to see the sand beneath their feet. They were in low Earth orbit, just a few hundred miles up. They were still wrapped in the protective embrace of the planet's magnetic field. They were still home. But in December of 1968, 3 men decided to swim out into the deep. They decided to do something that had never been done, something that many scientists said was impossible, or at least suicidal. They strapped themselves to the most powerful machine ever built, a skyscraper filled with explosive fuel, and aimed it not at the sky, but at the moon. They were leaving the cradle. They were going to a place where the Earth would shrink until it was just a marble that could be covered by a thumb. They were going to the dark side, where the sun never shines and the radio signals from home cannot reach. This is the story of Apollo 8. It is the story of the boldest gamble in the history of exploration. It is the story of a Christmas Eve that changed the way we see ourselves forever. Tonight, we travel back to that turbulent year. We climb inside the command module, we feel the rumble of the Saturn, and we drift out into the silence of the void to see our home for the very first time. To understand the magnitude of this journey, we must first understand the world they were leaving behind. The year was 1968. It is often remembered as one of the darkest, most chaotic years in modern history. The world was on fire. In Vietnam, the war was raging, consuming thousands of lives and dividing generations. In the streets of America and Europe, protests turned into riots. Cities were burning. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy had shattered the spirit of hope. It felt as though the fabric of civilization was tearing apart. The Cold War was at its peak, a frozen standoff between 2 nuclear superpowers, staring at each other with fingers on the button. There was fear. There was anger. There was a sense that humanity had lost its way. We were a species at war with itself, trapped on a small planet, running out of time. And in the middle of this chaos, there was NASA. The American Space Agency was in a desperate race against the Soviet Union to put a man on the moon before the end of the decade. President Kennedy had made the promise 7 years earlier, but time was running out, and things were not going well. The Apollo program had started in tragedy. In 1967, a fire on the launch pad had killed 3 astronauts, Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. It was a devastating blow. The program was grounded. The engineers had to tear apart the spacecraft and rebuild it from scratch. By the summer of 1968, NASA had only flown 1 manned mission, a simple orbital test called Apollo 7. They were miles behind the finish line. And then a secret report arrived from the CIA. The intelligence was alarming. Spy satellites had spotted a massive rocket on a launch pad in the Soviet Union. The Russians were preparing to launch a Zond spacecraft. They were going to send a man around the moon before the end of the year. If they succeeded, they would win the race. They would claim the psychological victory. America would be second again. NASA had a problem. The plan for the next mission, Apollo 8, was just another test in Earth orbit. They were supposed to test the lunar module, the spider-like lander that would eventually touch the moon. But the lunar module wasn't ready. It was a mess of bugs and wiring issues. It wouldn't be ready for months. The schedule was broken. The dream was dying. But then a quiet engineer named George Low had a crazy idea. an idea so bold that it terrified everyone in the room when he first whispered it. "If the lunar module isn't ready," he said, "leave it behind. If the Earth orbit mission is a waste of time, skip it. Let's take the command module, strap it to the giant Saturn V rocket, which had never flown with a crew before, and send it all the way to the moon. Right now, in 4 months." It was madness. It meant skipping 3 steps in the testing process. It meant sending 3 men 250,000 miles away in a ship that had only flown once. It meant relying on a single engine to get them into lunar orbit, and more importantly, to get them out. If that engine failed while they were at the moon, they would be trapped. They would circle the dead grey rock forever until their oxygen ran out. They would become the first permanent satellites of another world. The NASA administrators looked at the risks. They looked at the timeline. They looked at the spy photos of the Russian rocket. And they made the decision: go. They needed a crew. They needed 3 men who were cool under pressure, experienced, and perhaps a little crazy. They chose Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders. Frank Borman was the commander. He was a colonel in the Air Force, a test pilot with eyes like flint. He was no-nonsense, serious, and focused. He didn't care about the poetry of space. He cared about the mission. He wanted to beat the Russians, do the job, and get home to his wife Susan. He was the anchor. Jim Lovell was the command module pilot. He was the optimist, a warm, friendly man who loved the idea of exploration. He was a navigator at heart, a man who looked at the stars and saw a map. He had flown with Borman before on Gemini 7, spending 2 weeks in a capsule the size of a front seat of a Volkswagen. He knew how to endure, and Bill Anders was the rookie. The lunar module pilot, though there was no lunar module to fly. He was the systems engineer, the guy who knew every switch and breaker. He was also, crucially, the photographer. He was tasked with taking pictures of landing sites for future missions. He didn't know that he was about to take the most famous photograph in history. The training was brutal. Usually a crew had a year to prepare for a mission. Apollo 8 had 4 months. They worked 18 hours a day. They spent endless hours in the simulators, rehearsing every possible disaster. They practiced navigation by the stars. They practiced engine burns. They practiced what to do if the communications failed. They barely saw their families. The pressure was immense. As December approached, the tension in the world seemed to condense around Cape Kennedy in Florida. The press called it the Christmas voyage. But the families of the astronauts were terrified. Susan Borman asked the flight director, Chris Kraft, a simple question: "Is he coming back?" Kraft, a man of absolute honesty, looked at her and said, "We think so." It was the best promise he could give. The night before the launch, something extraordinary happened. The crew was in their quarters trying to relax. There was a knock at the door. It was Charles Lindbergh, the Lone Eagle, the man who had flown solo across the Atlantic Ocean in 1927, proving that an airplane could connect the continents. He was an old man now, but his eyes still held the fire of the pioneer. He asked to see the rocket. They took him out to the launch pad. It was dark. The floodlights were bathing the rocket in a spectral white glow, the Saturn V. It is hard to describe the scale of this machine to someone who hasn't seen it. It was 363 feet tall, taller than the Statue of Liberty. It weighed 6 million pounds. It was a cathedral of technology. Lindbergh stood at the base of the rocket, looking up. He calculated the fuel consumption. He turned to Frank Borman and said, "In the first second of your flight, this rocket will burn 10 times more fuel than I used to cross the entire Atlantic Ocean." It was a passing of the torch. From the propeller age to the jet age to the rocket age, from the atmosphere to the void. The next morning, December 21st, 1968, the sun rose over the Florida swamps. The air was cool and crisp. The sky was a perfect, piercing blue. It was a good day to leave the planet. The astronauts woke up before dawn. They ate the traditional breakfast of steak and eggs, high protein, low residue. They put on their white pressure suits. They walked out to the astrovan. As they drove to the pad, they saw the crowds. Hundreds of thousands of people lined the beaches and the highways. Cars were parked bumper to bumper for miles. People had camped out all night. In a year of war and riots, everyone wanted to see something beautiful. They wanted to see humanity reach for something higher than itself. The astronauts took the elevator up the red launch tower. They stood on the swing arm, 320 feet in the air. The view was incredible. The Atlantic Ocean stretched out to the horizon. They could see the curve of the coast. They took a last look at the world of trees, water, and air. Then, they climbed inside. The command module was small. It was a cone-shaped capsule, roughly the size of a large van interior, but packed with instrument panels, lockers, and 3 couches. Borman took the left seat. Lovell took the center. Anders took the right. The technicians strapped them in. They connected the oxygen hoses. They closed the heavy hatch. Clunk. The wheel turned. They were sealed in. For the next few hours, they were just cargo. They lay on their backs, legs in the air, listening to the hum of the gyroscopes and the hiss of the oxygen. Beneath them, the rocket was coming alive. The fuel pumps were spinning up. The liquid oxygen was boiling off, creating great clouds of white vapor that drifted down the side of the rocket like a waterfall. The rocket groaned and creaked as the super-cold fuel contracted the metal tanks. It felt like a living beast, waking up from a slumber, impatient to fly. T-minus 60 seconds. The firing room was a hive of activity. Go for launch. Guidance is internal. Pressurization complete. T-minus 10, 8, ignition sequence start. At T-minus 6 seconds, the 5 massive F1 engines at the base of the first stage ignited. It wasn't a sound at first, it was a vibration, a low tectonic rumble that shook the astronauts' teeth. The hold-down clamps kept the rocket bolted to the ground while the engines built up thrust. They were burning 15 tons of fuel per second. Lift-off. The clamps released. The Saturn V didn't leap off the pad. It lumbered. It was heavy. It rose slowly, majestically, riding a pillar of fire that was brighter than the sun. For the 3 men inside, the experience was violent. This was the first time humans had ridden a Saturn V. They didn't know what to expect. It was rougher than they imagined. The cabin shook wildly. The noise was a deafening roar that came through their helmets and their bones. They were being pressed into their seats by gravity. 2 Gs, 3 Gs, 4 Gs. Their chests felt heavy. It was hard to breathe. They were riding a controlled explosion. The rocket was steering itself, tilting over the ocean, punching a hole through the atmosphere. 2.5 minutes later, the first stage burned out. Bang! The separation was explosive. The astronauts were thrown forward against their straps as the massive booster fell away. Then, the second stage ignited. The ride smoothed out. The sky outside the small porthole windows turned from blue to indigo, and finally to the deepest black. They were in space, but they weren't safe yet. They were in a parking orbit. They were circling the Earth upside down, checking their systems. They were still tethered to home. They could look down and see the oceans, the clouds, the continents. They were moving at 17,500 miles per hour for 2 orbits. They waited. This was the critical moment. Mission Control in Houston had to check every number, every valve, every system. If anything was wrong, the mission would be scrubbed and they would come home. But everything was perfect. The machine was singing. Then came the voice of the SACOCOM, Mike Collins, the man who would later fly on Apollo 11 from Houston. Apollo 8, you are go for TLI. TLI. Trans-Lunar Injection. These were the words that changed history. It meant go for the moon. It meant lighting the third stage engine, the SIVB, and boosting their speed from 17,000 miles per hour to 25,000 miles per hour. It meant breaking the grip of Earth's gravity. No human had ever done this. Frank Borman put his hand on the control. Roger, Houston. They were over the dark side of the Earth, in the shadow of the planet, when the engine lit. The thrust pushed them back into their seats again. It was a long burn, 5 minutes and 17 seconds. It felt like an eternity. They watched the numbers on the computer climb, velocity increasing, altitude increasing. They were climbing the gravity well. They were surfing a wave of energy that would carry them across the void. And then the engine cut off. Silence. Absolute, crystal clear silence. The vibration stopped. The weight lifted. They were floating. They looked out the window, and what they saw took their breath away. Usually, when astronauts looked out the window, they saw the curve of the Earth filling the frame. They saw cities, storms, mountains. But now, the Earth was receding. It was getting smaller. They could see the whole circle. It was a glowing blue ball, hanging in the nothingness. It looked fragile. It looked lonely. And it was falling away from them at incredible speed. They were the first 3 humans to sever the bond. They were no longer Earthlings. They were creatures of the cosmos. Jim Lovell looked at the navigation stars. He looked at the receding Earth. He felt a strange sensation, not of fear, but of awe. They were truly alone. The radio crackled. Apollo 8. Houston, you are on your way. They were heading into the black. The journey had truly begun. The safety of the harbor was behind them. Ahead lay 240,000 miles of empty space and a gray, silent world that was waiting for them. Let the image of the receding Earth settle in your mind. Imagine watching your home, everything you have ever known, shrinking until it is just a bright ornament in the sky. The spacecraft, a tiny cone of aluminum, spun slowly in the barbecue roll, a rotation designed to keep the sun from overheating one side. Sun, Earth, black. Sun, Earth, black. The rhythm of the voyage. They settled in for the 3-day coast. The hard part of the launch was over, but the dangerous part, the unknown, was just beginning. They had to navigate across the ocean of night. They had to aim for a moving target, and they had to trust that the math was right. As we drift with them, leaving the Earth behind, feel the quiet of the capsule, the hum of the fans, the breathing of the men. We are traveling to a place where no life exists. We are traveling to the Christmas star. Relax. The orbit is steady. The trajectory is true. We are leaving the cradle. The engine was silent now. The violent shaking of the launch was a memory, fading into the static of the past. The roar that had rattled their bones had been replaced by a low, constant hum, the sound of fans, of coolant pumps, of the very lifeblood of the ship circulating around them. They were coasting. To the uninitiated, space travel is often imagined as a constant thrust, a rocket burning its way across the sky like an airplane fighting the wind. But the reality of orbital mechanics is far more passive. It is a surrender to momentum. They had been thrown by the hand of the giant Saturn V, and now they were simply a stone skipping across the blackest pond in existence. They were falling away from the Earth at 25,000 miles per hour. Yet inside the cabin, there was no sense of speed. There was no wind rushing past the windows. There were no clouds whipping by to give a sense of motion. If they closed their eyes, they could be sitting in a simulator in Houston. But when they opened them, the truth was waiting in the small, thick panes of glass. The Earth was shrinking. It is difficult to overstate the psychological impact of this sight. For every human who had ever lived before them, the Earth was the ground. It was the horizon. It was the sky. It was everything. Even for the astronauts who had flown before, The Earth was a massive, curving wall that filled the entire field of view. But for Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders, the Earth was becoming a thing, an object, a distinct, bounded sphere hanging in a void so empty and so dark that it felt heavy. They watched as the continents they knew, Africa, South America, the swirling white masses of clouds over the Atlantic, began to contract. The blue marble was falling away into the deep well of the night. It was the only splash of color in a universe of black and white. It was a beacon of life, warm and inviting, and they were leaving it behind. Inside the command module, the atmosphere was a strange mix of awe and discomfort. The capsule, named simply Apollo 8 inches, they hadn't been given the luxury of naming their ship like later crews, was a cone of aluminum and stainless steel, roughly 11 feet tall and 13 feet wide at the base. It was a technological marvel, a thermos bottle capable of keeping 3 men alive in the absolute zero of space. But it was also a closet. It was cramped, it smelled of pure oxygen, of plastic, and increasingly of 3 men who had no shower, no privacy, and no way to open a window. They were weightless now. The gravity of Earth was still pulling on them, slowing them down gradually, but they were in freefall. Their bodies floated against the straps. Pencils, checklists, and food packets drifted like lazy fish in an aquarium. In the beginning, zero gravity is euphoric. It is the dream of flight realized, but the human body is a creature of gravity. It evolved to feel the pull of the Earth. When that pull is gone, the inner ear, the delicate system of fluid-filled canals that tells us up from down, goes into panic mode. Frank Borman, the commander, the iron-willed test pilot, began to feel at first a nausea, a dizziness, a feeling that his stomach was floating into his throat. He tried to suppress it. He was the leader. He couldn't show weakness. But biology does not care about rank. He vomited, and then he suffered a bout of diarrhea. In the pristine, confined environment of a spacecraft, this was a crisis. In zero gravity, fluids do not fall into a bucket or a toilet. They form floating globules. They drift. They disperse. It was a nightmare scenario. The crew had to scramble with towels and vacuum hoses, cleaning the air, cleaning the cabin, cleaning the commander. The smell was acrid. The tension was palpable. For a few hours, the mission hung in the balance. If Borman was sick with a flu or a virus, could they continue? Were they contagious? Imagine being 50,000 miles from home in a metal box and getting the stomach flu. The isolation would be terrifying. Borman, to his credit, wanted to keep it quiet. He didn't want to worry mission control, but Jim Lovell and Bill Anders convinced him. They had to tell the doctors. They spoke to Houston on a private medical channel. The doctors on the ground analyzed the data and decided it was likely just space adaptation syndrome, motion sickness. It would pass. The mission would go on, but it was a stark reminder of their fragility. They were riding the most complex machine ever built, but they were still just biological organisms, soft and messy, traveling through a hostile void. As Borman recovered, the rhythm of the voyage settled in. They established a routine. They put the spacecraft into a passive thermal control role, affectionately known as the barbecue roll. If they stayed in one position, the side facing the sun would boil, reaching temperatures of 250 degrees Fahrenheit, while the side facing the dark would freeze at 250 degrees below zero. To keep the ship evenly heated, they set it to spin slowly on its long axis, one revolution every 20 minutes. Round and round they turned. Sun, Earth, stars, sun, Earth, stars. It was a hypnotic, slow-motion waltz. Every time the window rotated past the sun, the cabin would flood with blinding, unfiltered light, washing out the instrument panels. Then, 10 minutes later, they would plunge into gloom, illuminated only by the soft glow of the dials and the distant earth shine. It created a cycle of day and night that had nothing to do with the clock. Jim Lovell, the command module pilot, was the navigator. His job was to make sure they didn't get lost. It sounds absurd to think one could get lost going to the moon. It's the big bright thing in the sky. But space navigation is a game of precision. If their angle was off by just a fraction of a degree, they would miss the moon by thousands of miles, or worse, crash into it. They had a computer, the Apollo guidance computer, which was a miracle of 1960s engineering, but it had less processing power than a modern musical greeting card. It was robust, but they didn't trust it blindly. So Lovell used the stars. He used a sextant, a telescope device built into the side of the ship. It was the same principle used by Magellan and Columbus centuries earlier. He would peer through the eyepiece, finding a specific star, Sirius, Rigel, Procyon, and measure the angle between the star and the horizon of the Earth or the Moon. He would call out the numbers to Bill Anders, who would punch them into the computer. Mark, enter. Mark, enter. It was a beautiful fusion of the ancient and the futuristic. A man in a plastic ship, floating in the vacuum, using the light of distant suns to find his way across the dark ocean. Lovell loved the stars, but he noticed something strange. The further they got from Earth, the harder the stars were to see. The spacecraft was surrounded by a cloud of debris, ice crystals from water dumps, flakes of paint, particles of dust that caught the sunlight and sparkled. It was like driving through a snowstorm. He had to fight to see the constellations he knew so well. It made the isolation feel deeper. They were moving into a place where even the stars were hiding. Day 2 of the mission, December 22nd. They were now halfway to the moon. The Earth was a marble. The moon was growing. It was no longer a flat disk. It was beginning to show its spherical shape. It looked heavy. It looked bruised. The crew was tired. Sleeping in zero gravity is not like sleeping in a bed. You cannot lay your head on a pillow. You float. Your arms tend to drift upward, floating in front of your face like a zombie. If you don't strap yourself down, you will drift into a wall or a switch. The command module was noisy. The fans were loud. The thrusters would fire occasionally with a sharp bang hiss to keep the ship aligned, and there was the constant low-level anxiety. They were further from home than any human had ever been. They broke the altitude record set by Gemini 11. They crossed the 100,000 mile mark, then the 200,000 mile mark. They did television broadcasts back to Earth. In grainy black and white, they showed the viewers the interior of the ship. They floated a toothbrush. They showed how they made coffee, which was really just injecting hot water into a bag of powder. They tried to be light-hearted, but the world watching them was holding its breath. There was a delay in the radio signal now, a second or so. The voice of the Capcom in Houston would travel out, cross the void, be heard by the crew, and then their answer would travel back. It was a subtle reminder of the distance. On the afternoon of the second day, they crossed an invisible line, the equigravisphere. It is the point in space where the gravity of the Earth and the gravity of the Moon effectively cancel each other out. For the first 2 days, the Earth had been trying to pull them back. It had been slowing them down, dragging on their heels. But now, they crossed the threshold. The Moon took over. Suddenly, they were no longer slowing down. They were speeding up. The Moon had grabbed them. They were falling toward it. The speedometer on the dashboard began to climb. They were sliding down the gravity well of a foreign world. This realization brought a shift in perspective. Until now, the Moon had been a target, a destination. Now, it was a physical presence, a giant rock that was reeling them in. By December 23rd, the Moon was huge. It filled the windows. But it wasn't the beautiful silvery moon we see from Earth. It was a rugged, grey, pock-marked plaster ball. It looked hostile. There was no color, no blues, no greens, no whites, just shades of charcoal and cement. They could see the craters clearly now, the scars of billions of years of cosmic violence. It looked like a battlefield. Frank Borman looked at it and felt a cold sense of foreboding. He didn't see romance. He saw a dead world. He saw a place that didn't want them. It looks like a place made of plaster of Paris, Lovell said. Grey sand. They were approaching the most dangerous moment of the mission. The lunar orbit insertion. LOI, to orbit the moon, they couldn't just fly past it. They were moving too fast. If they did nothing, the moon's gravity would swing them around and fling them back out into deep space, or perhaps into a solar orbit from which they would never return. They had to slam on the brakes. They had to fire the service propulsion system, the massive engine on the back of the ship, to slow down enough to be captured by the moon's gravity. But there was a catch, a terrifying catch. Physics dictated that they had to perform this engine burn on the far side of the moon. The geometry of the orbit meant that the braking maneuver had to happen when they were behind the moon, completely blocked from the Earth. This meant they would lose radio contact. For the first time in the history of the space program, mission control would be blind and deaf. There would be no telemetry, no voice loop, no data. The astronauts would be on their own. If the engine didn't light, they would fly off into oblivion. If the engine burned too long, they would crash into the lunar surface. If the engine burned too short, they would skip off into an unstable orbit. It had to be perfect, and it had to be done in silence. As they approached the shadow of the moon, the tension in the capsule was electric. They put on their helmets. They strapped into their couches. They checked the checklists one last time. Mission Control gave them the final data. Apollo 8, you are go for LOI. Roger. Houston, go for LOI. The Capcom counted down to the loss of signal. 1 minute to LOIs. All systems go. Safe journey, guys. Thanks, Houston, Lovell said. We'll see you on the other side. And then the static came. The radio went dead. The constant carrier wave from Earth, the electronic umbilical cord that had connected them to humanity for 3 days, was severed. They slipped behind the edge of the moon. The sun disappeared. They were in the lunar shadow. It was darker than anything they had ever experienced. The Earth was blocked. The sun was blocked. The only light came from the stars, which burned with a fierce cold intensity in the absolute black. And below them, or above them, or beside them, was the moon. It was a massive, looming presence in the dark. They couldn't see it clearly yet, just a black hole in the starfield where the stars weren't, a massive void that blocked out the universe. They were 3 men in a tin can, 240,000 miles from home, cut off from their species. They were the loneliest humans who had ever lived. Borman watched the timer, burning in 3, 2, 1. He pushed the button. The engine roared to life. In the vacuum, they didn't hear the blast, but they felt the kick. The ships shuddered. They were pressed into their seats. The engine was fighting their momentum, slowing them down, forcing them into the embrace of the grey world. For 4 minutes and 15 seconds, the engine fired. It was the longest 4 minutes of their lives. Borman kept his hand near the cutoff switch. If the computer didn't stop the engine, he would have to do it manually. If he was 1 second late, they might die. The engine stopped. Silence returned. A heavier silence than before. They checked the numbers. Velocity perfect. Altitude perfect. They were in orbit. They were circling the moon. They unstrapped and floated to the windows. And now, as their eyes adjusted to the blue, they saw. They were flying just 60 miles above the surface. It was rushing by below them. A landscape of absolute desolation. Craters upon craters. Mountains that rose tens of thousands of feet. sharp and jagged because there was no wind to erode them. Ancient lava seas that looked like dry, grey oceans. "My God," Anders whispered, "look at that." It was terrifyingly close. It felt like they could reach out and touch the mountain peaks. It was a dead, monochromatic wasteland. It looked like the aftermath of a war that had ended 1 billion years ago, but they didn't have time to sightsee. They had to re-establish contact with mission control was sweating. In Houston, the clock was ticking. They knew exactly when the signal should return. If the astronauts had crashed, the silence would continue forever. If they had missed the burn, the silence would continue. The clock hit 0. Static. 10 seconds passed. Static. 20 seconds. The flight directors looked at each other. The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning humming. And then, a voice cut through the noise. "Houston, this is Apollo 8. We have completed the burn." Pandemonium in the control room. Men threw their headsets in the air. Cigars were lit. They were alive. They were in orbit. But up there, in the capsule, the mood was shifting. They had achieved the technical miracle. They were circling the moon. But they were about to discover that the moon wasn't the real prize. As they came around the eastern limb of the moon, emerging from the shadow, they saw something that wasn't on the flight plan, something that no human eyes had ever seen before. Bill Anders was at the side window, taking pictures of craters. He looked up. "Oh my God," he said. "Look at that over there." "What is it?" asked Borman. "That's the Earth coming up." "Wow, is that pretty?" It was the Earthrise. From behind the battered grey dead horizon of the moon, a brilliant blue and white sphere was lifting into the black sky. It was rising like a sun. It was vibrant. It was alive. It was the only colorful thing in the entire universe. It hung there, suspended in the void, fragile as a Christmas ornament. Anders scrambled for the color film. "Hand me that roll of color, quick!" He snapped the photo that would save 1968, the photo that would launch the environmental movement, the photo that showed us who we really are. They realized in that moment the true irony of their mission. They had traveled 240,000 miles to discover the moon, but what they really discovered was the Earth. They saw their home without borders. They saw it as one single system. One island of life in an infinite ocean of death. They felt a sudden, intense longing for that blue marble. The moon was interesting, scientific, and impressive, but it was cold. It was a graveyard. The Earth was warmth. It was coffee. It was music. It was family. They continued to orbit. 10 times they would circle this rock. It was Christmas Eve. Back on Earth, it was evening. Families were gathering for dinner. Churches were lighting candles. And everyone all over the world was turning on their radios and televisions. They were waiting to hear from the men in the moon. The astronauts knew they had to say something. They had a broadcast scheduled. The largest television audience in history was tuning in. 1 billion people. 1 out of every 4 humans alive was listening. NASA had told them, "Say something appropriate." They hadn't given them a script. They left it to the men. What do you say when you are the first humans to see the creation from the outside? What words are big enough to encompass the feeling of being small? They had thought about it for weeks. They had asked friends for advice. A journalist friend had told them to read from the Bible, not the New Testament, not the Old Testament specific to one religion, but the beginning, the story of origins. They opened the flight plan. Taped inside the back cover was a piece of fireproof paper with typed words. The camera clicked on, and then Bill Anders spoke. His voice was calm, clear, and echoed with the distance of the void. "For all the people on Earth," he said, "the crew of Apollo 8 has a message we would like to send you." He paused. "In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth." He read the first 4 verses of Genesis. He passed the microphone to Jim Lovell. "And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. Lovell read the next 4 verses. He passed the microphone to the commander. Frank Borman. Borman held the paper. He looked out the window at the desolate moonscape and then back at the vibrant distant earth. And God said, "Let the waters under the heaven be gathered together unto one place, and let the dry land appear." And it was so. He finished the reading. And from the crew of Apollo 8, we close with good night, good luck, a Merry Christmas, and God bless all of you on the good earth. The signal traveled back across the 250,000 miles. It washed over a world torn apart by war and hatred. For a moment, just a moment, the guns in Vietnam fell silent. The protests stopped. The arguments ceased. The world looked up at the moon in the night sky and they didn't see a rock. They heard a voice. They felt a connection. It was the first time humanity felt like a single family. But up in the ship, the moment of poetry was ending. The reality of survival was returning. They had orbited the moon 10 times. It was time to come home, and this was the terrifying part. To get home, they had to fire the engine again, the same engine that had put them into orbit. If it failed to light this time, they would stay there forever. They would become a tomb orbiting the moon for eternity. They were tired. They were mentally exhausted. But they had to be perfect one last time. They went behind the moon again, into the silence, into the radio blackout. Mission Control waited. The world waited. Would they come out? Borman's hand hovered over the switch. "Please," Lovell whispered. The future of the space program, the lives of 3 men, and the hope of a fractured world rested on a single valve opening in the dark. The timer counted down. 3, 2, 1, ignition. The engine roared. But did it roar enough? We drift in the silence with them, waiting for the kick, waiting for the push that will send them back to the blue marble. The Christmas voyage was only half over. The long fall home was about to begin. The dark side of the moon is a place of absolute, crushing isolation. It is not just the darkness, though the darkness is profound, a heavy, velvety curtain that blocks out the sun and the stars with equal indifference. It is the silence. It is the knowledge that between you and the rest of humanity stands a ball of rock 2,000 miles thick. Radio waves which travel at the speed of light, which can cross the void between galaxies, cannot penetrate stone. For the 45 minutes that Apollo 8 was behind the moon, they were severed from the timeline of human history. They were ghosts. They had orbited the moon 10 times. They had seen the craters, the mountains, the rills, the dead, grey scars of a dead, grey world. They had read from the book of Genesis. They had sent a message of peace to a planet at war, but now the poetry was over. The sightseeing was finished. Now they faced the cold, hard mechanics of survival. They had to leave, and to leave they had to perform the Trans-Earth Injection (TEE) burn. This was the single most dangerous maneuver of the entire mission. They were traveling at orbital velocity, circling the moon. If they did nothing, their orbit would decay and they would eventually crash into the dust. If they fired the engine too weakly, they would be flung into a highly elliptical orbit, trapped as permanent satellites of this desolate rock, circling it until their oxygen ran out and their fuel cells died. They would become a tomb, preserving their bodies in the vacuum for millions of years. To get home, the main engine, the Service Propulsion System, or SPS, had to fire for exactly 2 minutes and 23 seconds. It had to ignite instantly. It had to burn clean. And it had to happen while they were out of radio contact. Frank Borman sat in the commander's seat, his hand hovering near the manual controls. The computer was programmed to fire the engine automatically, but Borman didn't trust computers. He trusted his hands. He trusted his eyes. He watched the event timer counting down. 3 minutes to ignition, Lovell said. His voice was calm, the voice of a seasoned navigator, but his heart rate recorded by the biomedical sensors on his chest, was climbing. The spacecraft was oriented tail first. They were flying backward into the dark. They couldn't see where they were going. They could only see where they had been 2 minutes. The cabin was silent. The only sound was the rhythmic whoosh-whoosh of the oxygen fans and the shallow breathing of 3 men who knew that their lives hung on a single valve opening. The SPS engine was a marvel of engineering, but it was also a beast. It used hypergolic fuels, a fuel and an oxidizer that ignited on contact. There was no spark plug. There was no ignition key. When the valves opened and the liquids mixed, they exploded. It was a controlled explosion directed out of a nozzle. It was violent, it was powerful, and it had to work perfectly. 1 minute. Borman tightened his straps. "Hold on to your hats," he murmured. 10 seconds. 9, 8. The numbers dissolved into the flow of time. 0. Ignition. The engine roared. It wasn't a sound they heard with their ears, for the vacuum outside carried no noise. It was a sound they felt. It vibrated through the frame of the ship, through the couches, through their spines. It was a kick in the back, a sudden brutal acceleration that pinned them down. The G-meter climbed. They were heavy again. For 2 minutes and 23 seconds, the engine burned. It felt like an eternity. Borman watched the attitude indicator. The ship had to hold its line perfectly. If it wobbled, they would miss the Earth. They were aiming for a planet 240,000 miles away. The margin for error was razor thin. It was like trying to hit a coin with a rifle from 3 miles away, or riding on a roller coaster. Lovell watched the clock. Shut down in 10, 5. The engine cut off. The kick disappeared. They were weightless again. The sudden silence was deafening. They floated against their straps, checking the computer display. The numbers flashed on the DSK screen. Velocity increased. Trajectory nominal. They had done it. They had broken the moon's grip, but they didn't know for sure if they were safe. Not yet. They were still behind the moon. They had to wait until they swung around the limb of the lunar horizon to reacquire the signal from Earth. On the ground in Houston, the tension was unbearable. The Mission Control Center was a sea of white shirts and skinny ties, wreathed in cigarette smoke. The flight directors paced the aisles. The families of the astronauts sat in their homes, staring at silent speakers. The world waited. If the burn had failed, the silence would continue. The clock would tick past the acquisition time, and the static would never end. Jerry Carr, the SACOM soul, staring at the timeline. "Acquisition of signal in 1 minute," he announced. The seconds ticked by. 50, 40, 30. The giant radio dish in Goldstone, California, scanned the edge of the moon, listening for the faint pulse of the carrier wave. 10 seconds. "Come on." Someone whispered in the control room, "Come on home." And then a spike on the telemetry monitors, a wave of data, a voice. "Houston, Apollo 8. Please be informed there is a Santa Claus." It was Jim Lovell's voice. Pandemonium broke out in Houston. Men cheered. They clapped. Some wept openly. "There is a Santa Claus." It was the code they had agreed upon to signal a successful burn. It was a joke, but it was also a profound truth. On that Christmas morning, they had been given the greatest gift of all, the path home. Back in the capsule, the mood shifted from tension to exhaustion, and then to relief. As they coasted out from behind the moon, they saw it receding. For the last 20 hours, the moon had been a monster. A giant, looming wall of grey craters that filled their windows and dominated their minds. But now, as they accelerated toward Earth, the moon began to shrink. They watched it go. They saw the Sea of Tranquility. They saw the crater Tsiolkovsky on the dark side. They saw the Terminator line, the border between day and night, sweeping across the jagged mountains. "It looks like a place you don't want to visit," Anders said. It looked lonely. They were leaving the graveyard. They were heading back to the garden. Now began the long coast home. The return journey is often the forgotten part of the Apollo missions. The history books focus on the launch, the landing, and the splashdown. But the coast, the 3 days of falling through the void, is where the soul of the mission lies. It is a time of transition. The spacecraft was now traveling at escape velocity. The moon's gravity was trying to pull them back, slowing them down, but they had enough speed to escape. As they moved further away, the Earth's gravity began to take over. They were cresting the hill, and soon they would begin the long slide down into the gravity well of home. The cabin was a mess. After days in zero gravity, the pristine environment of the launch was gone. Food wrappers drifted in corners. Checklists floated loose. The air smelled of wet ashes, ozone, and unwashed bodies. They hadn't showered in nearly a week. They had been sweating in their pressure suits, then shivering in their flight coveralls. They were growing beards, itchy, scratchy stubble that annoyed them in the dry air. They were tired, bone-tired. Frank Borman, the commander, had barely slept. He was responsible for the lives of his crew. Every noise, every creak of the hull woke him up. He was running on adrenaline and willpower. Jim Lovell and Bill Anders were exhausted too. The adrenaline of the lunar orbit was fading, replaced by a deep, heavy fatigue. They tried to sleep. They zipped themselves into their sleeping bags, which were tethered to the walls. But sleeping in space is strange. You close your eyes and you float. Without the pressure of a bed against your back, you feel like you are falling. You startle awake, grasping for something solid. But despite the exhaustion, there was a sense of peace. They were coming home. They spent hours just looking out the windows. The Earth was growing larger. It was no longer a marble, it was a baseball. Then a grapefruit, then a bowling ball. They could see the weather patterns. They could see a cyclone spinning over the Pacific. They could see the brown expanse of Africa. They could see the sun glinting off the oceans. It was vibrant. It was alive. They compared it to the moon they had just left. The moon is a witness to the past, Lovell thought. It is dead. It has no wind, no water, no life. It is a fossil. But the Earth is the future. They began to understand the Brevery effect, the cognitive shift that happens when you see your home from a distance. They realized that the boundaries they fought over, the borders between the US and the USSR, between North and South Vietnam, were invisible. They were imaginary lines drawn by politicians on a map that didn't exist in reality. From 100,000 miles away, there was only one border, the thin blue line of the atmosphere, separating life from death. They realized that the spaceship they were riding, Apollo 8, was just a smaller version of the spaceship everyone else was riding. Earth, we came all this way to explore the moon, Anders said, echoing the thought that had struck them earlier, and the most important thing is that we discovered the Earth. They transmitted more television pictures. They showed the growing Earth to the viewers at home. It's a beautiful place, Borman said to the camera. It looks like the only color in the universe. Down below, the world was still chaotic. The war was still happening, the protests were still happening, but for a few days, people paused. They looked up at the sky, they looked at the grainy images on their screens, and they felt a sense of unity that hadn't existed before. The astronauts received news updates from Mission Control. They were told that their reading of Genesis had been heard by millions. They were told that people were praying for them. They were also told about the Man of the Year award from Time magazine. It was given to them, to the three men in the plastic cone. But fame felt distant. It felt abstract. The reality was the instrument panel. The reality was the oxygen levels. The reality was the trajectory. Jim Lovell was back at the sextant. Navigation on the return trip was critical. They were hitting a moving target. The Earth is spinning at 1,000 miles per hour. It is orbiting the Sun at 67,000 miles per hour, and the spacecraft was coming in at 25,000 miles per hour. Lovell had to measure the angle between the stars and the Earth's horizon to pinpoint their location. He checked the star charts: Sirius, Canopus, Vega. Mark, enter. The computer crunched the numbers. "We are right down the groove," Lovell said. They were aiming for a corridor in the atmosphere that was only 26 miles wide. Think about that. They had traveled 500,000 miles round trip, and they had to hit a target that was narrower than the distance between Washington, D.C. and Baltimore. If they came in steeper than 6.5 degrees, the G-forces would be lethal. They would be crushed into jelly, and the heat shield would be overwhelmed. They would burn up like a meteor. If they came in too shallower than 5.5 degrees, they would bounce off. The atmosphere acts like water. If you throw a stone at a shallow angle, it skips. If they skipped, they would fly back out into deep space. Their batteries would die. Their oxygen would run out. They would be lost forever. They had to thread the needle. As the hours turned into days, the Earth grew massive. It stopped being an object and started becoming a world again. December 27th, the final day. They were accelerating. The Earth's gravity was pulling them in, faster and faster. 20,000 miles per hour, 22,000 miles per hour, 24,000 miles per hour. They were falling into the sky. Mission Control gave them the final check. Apollo 8, you are go for entry. Roger, Houston. They had to prepare the ship. The Apollo spacecraft consists of two parts: the command module, the cone where they lived, and the service module, the cylinder with the big engine and the fuel cells. The service module had done its job. It had taken them to the moon and brought them back. But it had no heat shield. It could not survive the fire. They had to cut it loose. Jettison service module, Borman commanded. He threw a switch. Bang. Explosive bolts fired. The two ships separated. The service module drifted away. It would enter the atmosphere separately and burn up, a sacrificial lamb scattering its debris across the Pacific Ocean. Now, they were just the cone. 3 men in a tiny bell-shaped room, with their backs to a layer of epoxy resin and fiberglass that was the only thing standing between them and 5,000 degrees of heat. They fired the small maneuvering thrusters to turn the command module around. They had to face the heat shield forward. They were flying blind, back first into the atmosphere. They looked out the windows one last time. The sky was black. The stars were bright. But ahead was the blue glow of the atmosphere. "It looks like a blue haze," Lovell said. They checked their straps. They tightened them until they hurt. They stowed every loose pencil, every camera, every food packet. Anything loose would become a missile during deceleration. They checked the biomedical sensors. Their hearts were beating fast, not from exertion but from anticipation. This was the end of the voyage, the final exam. Physics was about to take over. They were hitting the atmosphere at Mach 32 times the speed of sound. The kinetic energy was immense. The ship had to convert that energy into heat to slow down. It was like driving a car into a brick wall, but the wall was made of air. "Entry interface in 1 minute," Lovell called out. The radio would soon cut out. The ionization blackout. As the air molecules slammed into the heat shield, they would be stripped of their electrons, creating a sheath of plasma around the ship. This plasma blocks all radio waves. Mission Control would lose them. The world would lose them. For 4 minutes, they would be inside a fireball. 30 seconds. They took a deep breath. "See you on the water," Borman said. And then the first wisp of pink light appeared outside the window. It was delicate at first, a faint violet glow. Then it turned pink, then orange, Then a blinding, roaring yellow. The hiss of the air began. It started as a whisper, then grew to a roar. The G-forces hit them. It wasn't like the launch. The launch was a vibration. This was a crushing weight, an invisible elephant sitting on their chests. Gravity, which they hadn't felt for 6 days, was back with a vengeance. They were heavy. They were pinned. Outside, the temperature of the shockwave hit 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hotter than the surface of the sun. The heat shield was ablating, burning away, layer by layer, carrying the heat with it. Chunks of flaming material flew past the windows. Inside, the temperature rose. The cabin got stuffy. They couldn't speak. They could only breathe in shallow gasps. The darkness of space was gone. They were inside a meteor. The world outside the window was on fire. Inside the command module, the three men were no longer astronauts floating in the serene silence of the void. They were passengers in a falling meteor. The sensation of speed, which had been absent for 6 days, was now terrifyingly real. They weren't just moving, they were colliding. They were colliding with the atmosphere of their home planet at 25,000 miles per hour. The air molecules, unable to move out of the way fast enough, were being crushed against the blunt end of the heat shield, heating up to temperatures that rivaled the surface of the sun, 5,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It is a number that the human mind struggles to comprehend. Steel melts at 2,500 degrees. Rock melts at 2,200. They were flying through a plasma storm that would vaporize a normal ship in seconds. Frank Borman, Jim Lovell, and Bill Anders were pressed into their couches by an invisible, crushing hand. Gravity, the force they had escaped on launch day, had returned with a vengeance. It wasn't the gentle 1G of sitting in a chair, it was 6 Gs. 6 times their normal body weight. Their chests felt like they were covered in lead. Their faces were pulled back. Drawing a breath was a conscious physical effort, like lifting a heavy weight with their lungs. They couldn't speak. They could only grunt and strain, their eyes fixed on the instrument panel, watching the G-meter climb. Outside the thick, multi-layered glass of the portholes, the view was apocalyptic. The blackness of space was gone. The stars were gone. The moon was a memory. There was only the glow. It started as a pale violet, the color of ionized air. Then it shifted to a deep, angry neon orange, and finally to a blinding, incandescent white. It was brighter than the day. Chunks of the heat shield, the epoxy resin designed to burn away and carry the heat with it, were tearing loose, flying past the windows like flaming debris from a burning building. They were inside the fireball, and they were alone. This was the blackout. The ionization around the ship was so intense that it formed a shield against radio waves. No voice could get in. No data could get out. Mission control in Houston was dead silent. The families of the astronauts, sitting in their living rooms, were silent. The millions of people watching on television were silent. For 3 minutes, the Apollo 8 spacecraft was a ghost. In the control room in Houston, the flight directors stared at their consoles. They smoked cigarettes with shaking hands. They watched the clock. They knew exactly how long the blackout should last. If the clock ran past that time, if the silence stretched on, it meant the heat shield had failed. It meant the ship had burned up. It meant the Christmas voyage had ended in tragedy. The seconds ticked by. Inside the capsule, the heat was soaking through the walls. The air conditioner was fighting a losing battle. The temperature rose. The smell of hot metal and singed insulation filled the cramped space. They were sweating, gasping, holding on. They were falling from the sky, decelerating from 25,000 miles per hour to subsonic speeds in a matter of minutes. It was the most violent braking maneuver in history. And then the G-forces peaked. The pressure held for a moment, crushing them down, and then it began to ease. The crushing weight lifted slightly. The bright white fire outside the window began to fade. It turned back to orange, then to pink, and then suddenly it was gone. The glow vanished. In its place was something they hadn't seen in 6 days: blue. Not the black of space, not the gray of the moon, but the soft, welcoming, powdery blue of the Earth's sky. The radio crackled. The static cleared. Apollo 8, Houston, came the voice of Ken Mattingly, the Capcom. Everything looks good. Jim Lovell let out a breath he felt he had been holding since they left the lunar orbit. He keyed his mic. Roger, Houston, we are reading you loud and clear. A cheer went up in mission control, a roar of relief that echoed around the world. They had survived the fire. They had pierced the atmosphere. They were home. But the danger wasn't over. They were still falling like a rock. They were dropping through the stratosphere at hundreds of miles per hour. If the parachutes didn't open, they would hit the ocean with the force of a bomb. They watched the altimeter unwinding. 24,000 feet. The automatic system fired the mortars. Boom! 2 small drogue parachutes shot out from the nose of the capsule. They caught the air with a violent snap. The capsule, which had been tumbling slightly, jerked upright. It swung back and forth like a pendulum. It was a rough ride, dizzying and chaotic, but it meant the system was working. Drogues are out, Borman reported. She's swinging. They fell further, through the clouds. 10,000 feet. This was the moment of truth. The main chutes. 3 mortars fired. 3 pilot chutes pulled out the massive bags. And then the flowers bloom. 3 giant parachutes, striped in orange and white, unfurled above the ship. They were magnificent. They were beautiful. They caught the thick air of the lower atmosphere and slowed the fall to a gentle drift. The violent shaking stopped. The roaring wind quieted to a breeze. They were floating. They looked out the windows. Below them was the Pacific Ocean. It wasn't the abstract blue mass they had seen from space. It was real water, textured, dark, with white caps on the waves. It was waiting for them. It was dawn in the Pacific. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the clouds in gold and violet. It was December 27th. They had missed Christmas on Earth, but they had given the world a Christmas present that would never be forgotten. Prepare for impact, Borman said. They braced themselves in their couches. The ocean looked soft from a distance, but hitting it at 20 miles per hour is like hitting a concrete wall. Splash. The impact was harder than they expected. Water sprayed over the windows. The capsule groaned, and then chaos. The parachutes, catching the wind, dragged the capsule sideways before they were cut loose. The ship tipped over. It rolled. Instead of floating upright like a cone, it flipped upside down. This was a known condition called stable do. The astronauts were hanging from their straps, facing the floor. The blood rushed to their heads. They looked out the windows and saw green water and bubbles. They were underwater. For a moment, panic flared. Were they sinking? Was there a leak? But then, the righting system activated. 3 large balloons on the nose of the capsule began to inflate. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the ship began to roll back over. It broke the surface. It bobbed upright. They were floating. They were safe. Borman, Lovell, and Anders unstrapped. They were heavy. Their arms felt like lead weights. Their legs felt weak. After 6 days of weightlessness, the gravity of Earth felt oppressive. It pulled at their skin, their internal organs. It was the price of admission for returning home. But the air, they opened the ventilation valve. The air from the Pacific Ocean rushed in. It didn't smell like filtered oxygen. It didn't smell like burnt electronics. It smelled of salt. It smelled of iodine. It smelled of humidity and life. It was the sweetest breath they had ever taken. Within minutes, the Navy helicopters were hovering overhead. Divers jumped into the water, swimming to the capsule to attach the flotation collar. One of the divers looked through the window. He gave a thumbs up. Jim Lovell smiled back, a tired, bearded, triumphant smile. They were hoisted up to the helicopter one by one. As they were lifted into the air, they looked down at their ship. It was scorched black. The heat shield was charred and pitted. The beautiful silver skin was gone. It looked like a piece of toast that had been left in the fire too long. It had given its life to protect them. They landed on the deck of the USS Yorktown. The sailors cheered. The band played, but the astronauts were wobbly. They walked with the strange, high-stepping gait of men who have forgotten how to walk. They were dizzy, but they were back. The mission was over. The race was won. America had beaten the Soviets to the moon, but in the days and weeks that followed, something strange happened. The world didn't talk about the technology. They didn't talk about the F-1 engines or the trajectory calculations. They didn't talk about the Cold War victory. They talked about the Earth. They talked about the photo. Earthrise. That single image of the blue marble rising over the grey desert became the icon of the century. It appeared on magazine covers, on posters, in classrooms. It changed us. Before Apollo 8, we looked at the map and saw nations. We saw borders. We saw us and them. After Apollo 8, we looked at the photo and saw a spaceship. We saw a tiny, fragile life support system floating in a hostile void. We saw that the atmosphere is paper-thin. We saw that the water is finite. We saw that we are all crew members on the same vessel. It is no coincidence that the Environmental Protection Agency was founded shortly after. It is no coincidence that Earth Day was created shortly after. Apollo 8 launched the ecology movement. It gave us a mirror to look at ourselves, and then there was the telegram. Frank Borman received thousands of letters and telegrams after the mission, but there was one that stood out. It was from a stranger. It was short. It just said, "To the crew of Apollo 8, thank you. You saved 1968. And in a way, they did. In a year of assassinations, riots, and war, they gave the world a moment of pure, unadulterated awe. They gave us a moment of silence. They reminded us that we are capable of great things, that we are not just creatures of conflict, but creatures of curiosity, that we can leave the cradle. As we reach the end of our journey tonight, let us reflect on what it means to leave home. We often think of exploration as going out there, going to the new place, conquering the new territory. But the lesson of Apollo 8 is that we go out there to understand down here. We travel to the unknown to appreciate the known. Frank Borman later said, "We were so focused on the moon, but the most important thing we saw was the Earth." Imagine yourself now drifting back from that high vantage point. Leave the lunar orbit. Leave the cold, grey silence of the craters. Drift back across the 240,000 miles. Approach the blue marble. See the clouds swirling. See the oceans shimmering in the sun. It is a garden. It is the only place in the universe where we know for sure that life exists. It is the only place where there is laughter, where there is music, where there is love. It is a miracle, and you are part of it. You are one of the passengers on this beautiful blue ship. Feel the gravity holding you. It is not a cage, it is a hug. It is the earth holding onto you, keeping you safe from the cold vacuum. Feel the air in your room. It is part of that same thin blue line that Bill Anders saw from the window. It is the breath of the planet. Inhale, exhale. You are home. The rocket is silent. The fire is out. The ocean is calm. The three men, Borman, Lovell, Anders, are old now, or gone, but their journey remains. It remains in the photo that hangs on walls all over the world, and it remains in the quiet knowledge that we're not alone in the dark. We have each other. The Christmas voyage is over, but the message continues. Good night, Apollo 8. Good night, travelers. Good night, Earth. Sleep well.